Afternoon again, everyone. If folks might be joining, but we'll go ahead and get started because we have a lot of interesting content to share with you all. But my name is Carolina Bravo Karimi. I'm an employment partner at Wilson Turner Kosmo. We're a woman-owned firm here in San Diego, and I'm also the newly appointed chair of our diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. And I am accompanied by Hannah Cole, if you wanted to introduce yourself. Oh, you're still on Zoom, on mute, Hannah.
That's fine. There we go. That's why video is so helpful. So thanks again, everybody. I'm Hannah Cole, Associate General Counsel at Becton Dickinson and Company. We're a medical device and technology company headquartered out in New Jersey, and I focus on employment matters for the company. I am also on the board of the ACC San Diego chapter. So thank you, everybody, for coming and for joining us today.
Wonderful. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So today's presentation, I like to call it a workshop because it will require a little bit of work from you all, is really about trying to recognize and then hopefully gain some tools on how to interrupt microaggressions. So we'll be providing some introductory content, hopefully some anecdotal examples. Hannah has many. Please feel free to use the chat function if you'd like to ask us any questions or if you have any comments. We'll both be monitoring them throughout, but you'll probably be hearing Hannah and I talk most of the time. So let's go ahead and get started. Obviously, I'm a lawyer. I love roadmaps. So to give you all a little roadmap of where we'll be going for the next hour or so, we're just going to do a really mini discussion about how unconscious bias really is at the root of microaggressions and to really understand why and what that means. Then we'll go into a pretty robust conversation about how to recognize microaggressions, giving you some examples and the potential intent when someone makes a microaggression, but then unfortunately the impact of those communications. We'll then discuss why microaggressions are harmful, because for those who have experienced them, you know that they can be quite harmful. And then again, like I said, really focusing on giving you all tools to figure out how to interrupt them. We're going to go through two hypotheticals to really test those tools to make sure that you take away some idea of what to do or what to say in the moment of experiencing or witnessing a microaggression. So to start us off, Hannah, if you'd like to, I'll go ahead and introduce it, but if you wanted to give an example. So this is a moment for everyone to just reflect for a moment. Think about an identity group to which you belong. Think about 3 positive traits or privileges that you associate with that identity group, but then also think about 3 challenges or 3 burdens or negative traits that are associated with that for just a moment.
And for me, I think, there's so many different sort of groups that we all belong to and are comfortable in. And one for me would be just a lawyer. So positive traits or assumptions about lawyers is that they're confident, they're smart, they're articulate. But negative traits, maybe that they're aggressive, that they're dishonest, that they're bad at math. That last one may be true for some like me. But there's definitely sort of that bargaining that goes on. And I will say, especially being in-house, I have to experience and address that when I am advising managers in HR, because I know that these traits sort of come with it. They come with the title, with the profession that we all have.
Absolutely. And so what this exercise really allows us to do is to really understand the fact that so often what we associate as either positive or negative can be rooted in stereotype, can be rooted in unconscious bias, but it can also be rooted in our personal experiences. Social scientists who have engaged in this exercise tend to conclude that a lot of the positive traits that we feel about our identity group tend to come from our own experiences. Not all, but tend to come from our own experiences. Whereas a lot of the negative traits or the burdens or the challenges that we associate with being in an identity group tend to come from external sources that are based in unconscious bias. And one source of that contributes to potential negativity that you feel about an identity group can be microaggressions. And so that's why we thought that this introductory exercise would set us up nicely. So what is unconscious bias? I'm sure many of you have attended several workshops, if not within your organizations, through ACC and others. So we won't spend too much time on this, but obviously we as humans are flooded with millions and millions of bits of information at a time, but we can actually only process 40 bits of information at a time. So we need these very robust cognitive filters to get rid of a majority of the information that we need to function, to prioritize, to generalize, to survive as humans. I always like to give the example of typing. The first time you type, you do it with the 2 fingers. Maybe some of us still do, that's okay. But over time, you actually probably type not even really consciously knowing where those keys are on your keyboard. That is because of the unconscious biases that our brains have that allow us to do things quicker, be more efficient. Unfortunately, as we all know, many times some of these unconscious biases can get in the way of objective decision-making, or what we're really going to focus on today. It can really impact or influence the way that we communicate with others, and inadvertently or intentionally engage in communication that's harmful to the people around us.
So everyone has these unconscious biases. It's not sexist people or racist people. It is all people have some form of unconscious bias that informs the way that they think about things, including those who firmly believe that prejudice and discrimination are wrong, are bad. Personally, I know that when I was young, I came home and told my mom that I was very upset because my dad had lied to me. He had told me he was going to college, and only women go to college, because I had been surrounded by strong, independent women who had all sought higher education. And so in my experience, I really felt that it was really just women that were allowed to go. And that was informing sort of the way that I saw the world. And, as I got older, even less specific to just, race or protected categories, I've discovered that I had a bit of a bias against top tier schools. In my experience, because I had made choices in my life about where I would go to, what schools I would go to, and scholarships, and I'm very smart. So I made very smart decisions, and folks who went to other schools likely made, less significant life choices than I did. It wasn't a conscious thought process that I had, but I recognized that as I would look at resumes for folks coming in, I would have this instinctual kick about what it meant, depending on where that person had gone to school. So it comes at us from all different ways. And as Carolina mentioned, it's informed by our life, by our experiences, by our communities. And they come in, and we know that we're going to have them in some ways that they're used as shortcuts, but these shortcuts can often have unintended consequences on those around us. They can cause people to overlook great ideas. They could cause people like me to overlook great candidates based on school distinctions. And so we need to find a way to interrupt these unconscious biases to make sure that we're using the smart, slower part of our brain to make decisions that are important.
So now we'll actually go ahead and transition to a specific discussion of how we all can start recognizing microaggression. So big kind of overarching comment before Hannah gives us a definition is, at least for me, I thought I knew a lot about what may or may not be a microaggression, but it actually has taken me a lot of time to read about this, to talk to people in my community and outside my community that have experienced this, to actually be a better identifier, meaning, oh, I just issue spotted it. I just saw it. So I say that because there will likely be a lot of examples and a lot of things that we talk about today that maybe a lot of you have actually engaged in, and you're thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, I can't even believe that that is how that might be interpreted. So just have an open mind, be open to the fact that there may be a lot of examples or things discussed here you might have not otherwise thought about before.
Mm-hmm. So the term microaggression was coined by psychiatrist and Harvard University professor Chester M. Pierce in the 70s to describe insults and dismissals which he regularly witnessed non-Black Americans inflicting upon African Americans. So what was that definition? The everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So it's really focused just on potentially smaller issues. They are micro in the way in which they're communicated, but that doesn't mean that that's the way that their effect has on the folks who are targets of these. And in many of cases, these hidden messages or these small cues can invalidate the group identity or the experiential reality of the target folks who are experiencing this. It can demean them on a personal or even a group level, and it can communicate to them that they are lesser than, suggest that they don't belong in the majority group, or threaten and intimidate them, suggesting that they really belong or deserve sort of inferior status. And again, they could be based on race, gender, age, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, ability, class. It's not limited to any particular type of category. And very often it's not intended to be hurtful or harmful. But as Carolina mentioned at the outset, there really is a difference between the intent behind these communications and the impact that they have on individuals. So the first step in identifying and addressing these types of microaggressions is to recognize when it occurs and what type of communication or message it's sending.
Something that's really important to note in a discussion like this, and it's something that I've actually grappled with, because when I hear the term micro, I think small, right? But then you think aggression and you think, oh, that's serious. And so I think what's important here is to understand that microaggressions live on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, we have what are termed micro assaults. On the other end of the spectrum, we have what are termed micro invalidations. And their microaggressions can really live anywhere within this spectrum, which means that the impact that they may or may not have on the recipient of the communication can be quite different as well. So microassaults, these are explicit derogations and purposely discriminatory actions or communications. It's essentially explicit racism, discrimination, misogyny, etc. And so one example that is a communicative, but not necessarily with words, that a lot of social scientists identify as a microassault is the Confederate flag, because of the impact that it may have on certain communities here in the United States. Somewhere more in the middle of the spectrum of the microaggression spectrum, we have what are micro insults. These are behavioral or verbal remarks that convey rudeness, insensitivity, and can demean a person's heritage or identity. They're often subtle snubs outside the level of the awareness of the communicator, the microaggressor, but they clearly convey a hidden message that insults the recipient. So again, that impact really being the focus there. A common example that is used, again, it's not necessarily words, but communication is within the 4-year, in high school, there's a lot of data out there that shows that high school counselors tend to encourage students of color, Black and brown students, to maybe attend a 2-year community college or a 4-year state school, as opposed to their, members of the dominant culture, which in the United States is the Caucasian or white community, being encouraged to pursue 4 years. So the intent, subconscious, unconscious, might not be intended to be anything, but it's certainly conveying a message to those Black and brown students. And then where we're probably going to spend the most time here today is what social scientists called micro-invalidations. These are verbal comments or behaviors that exclude, negate, nullify the psychological thoughts, the feelings, or the experiential reality of people. And they are most likely unintentional, not always, but most likely, which makes it that much more challenging, right? It's easy to identify when someone is intentionally trying to harm someone or demean someone, but it's a lot more difficult in a context where the communicator is really not intending to say anything disrespectful. So with that, we're going to go to our first grouping of microaggressions. These are identified by social scientists at UCLA and have been distributed kind of to every academic institution around the country. So it's by no means categories according to Hannah and Carolina, but categories according to the experts in the social science field. And the first is alien in the own land. So this is described as circumstances in which Asian American and Latinos and Latinas or others who look different than the dominant culture. Again, you'll keep hearing me say dominant culture. Here in the United States, that is the white and Caucasian. And so typically it's people who don't look like the dominant culture who are assumed to be foreign born. So as you see on your screen, we have this young Asian American woman, and let me kind of set the scene for you. She is meeting someone for the first time, and the other person says, "Oh, where are you from?" And she says, "Oh, I grew up in Los Angeles." And then the follow-up question is, no, really, like, where are you from? And so what is the message that she is receiving in this moment? You are not a true American. You are a perpetual foreigner in your own country, and your race makes you different. And so, for example, in a situation like this, something else, she could, her family could have been here for 4 generations, and she just truly feels like, American at the end of the day, which she is, being 4th generation. And so the message there is really about otherness. But let's think for a moment from the communicator standpoint. It's not necessarily true that the communicator was trying to other the person. Maybe there was a true curiosity about where her family was from, or, maybe she has a last name that was sounding Asian American. So the intent was, I'm really curious about you. I want to know about your past. But unfortunately, there's a gap between that intent and the ultimate impact. And we need to be mindful as people who are striving to, create inclusive environments and inclusive organizations. We need to be mindful of that gap, of that space between the intent and the space between the impact, because when people feel other, they feel excluded. So other common examples of alien in own land are, asking someone who doesn't look like the dominant culture, where are you from? Or where, oh, you look so interesting, or you look so exotic, or, hey, could you teach me how to say certain words in your language, assuming that that person actually speaks, whether it's Cantonese or Spanish or, whatever language it may be. And then something that I have personally experienced, and it wasn't until I attended a workshop like this that I was told that I had license to feel offended, right? Because something that we sometimes do when we're the target of a microaggression is think, oh, I'm being oversensitive, or, oh my gosh, I just need to let it go, is when people that I have worked with for a long time continue to mispronounce my name. So I have a very unique name. I accept that. So if you're meeting me for the first time and you mispronounce it, no big deal. But if you've worked with me for 5 years and you continue to mispronounce my name, it does make me feel like other. So again, from a point of view of inclusivity, of respect, to be really mindful of getting our coworkers and our friends' names right. Maybe, and if you don't know how to pronounce it, simply asking. So a good kind of solution in a situation like this, because I myself have engaged in this microaggression inadvertently, I don't ask anybody where they are from. I ask people where they grew up, and I don't only ask people that are not from the dominant culture, meaning go around the room if you're in a group environment and you you make it a habit or a practice of asking people where they grew up, because you want to bond with them.
So another form of these microaggressions could be the ascription of intelligence. And you see here just in this picture of this woman, why do you sound so white? Or that sounds almost accusatory. It could be, oh, you sound so white. Or I didn't know you were Black when we spoke on the phone. So there is an assumption that suggests that because she is African-American, she should sound or speak a different way. And I'll do another little confession. I am a big consumer of reality television. And in particular, I very much enjoyed The Housewives, all the Real Housewives. And I was watching a recent season of The Real Housewives of New York City. And there was conflict between the women, as there is. And one of the women was explaining why she reacted strongly to being told that she sounded angry. She's African American, and she was explaining the context behind that and why that was triggering for her, and what that is used, how that is used against women of her color. And after that, this conversation, this woman who is an attorney and is a commentator politically, is leaving, and one of the other white cast members said, you know, you're very articulate. I don't know if anyone ever told you that. Now, she wasn't trying to be rude. And in fact, this particular cast member is very liberal and would be very much in favor of equal rights and would hate to see discrimination, would call it out when she spotted it, and yet she stepped right into it. And the assumption with what she is saying is that, one, you are articulate, and that would not be typical of someone that's African American, and two, probably nobody else has ever told you that. You wouldn't have recognized that yourself. So there's this sort of assumption that people of color, that women of color, are generally not as intelligent. And if they demonstrate any form of intelligence, it's unusual. It's, oh, this is different. This is not anticipated because of your color, because of your race. And it can be used in other ways too. For example, an Asian person who there's a stereotype that they're all very smart. So, oh, you must be really good at math. Can you help me with this math problem? Or a woman of color who's explaining her profession, they're like, oh, I would never have guessed that you were a scientist. So these statements, again, they may not be intentional. And in fact, it could be from the speaker a way of saying, oh, I'm impressed by you. But the reason that they are comfortable expressing this type of general impression of them, and maybe the reason they have it in the first place, is because they are not anticipating it from someone of that race or that color.
I think a great takeaway from these first two examples, and we're going to go through a few more, is really to do some self-reflection of when and to whom you are making these comments that are intended to be complimentary or intended to be flattering. If you remark about everyone's articulateness, and that's just something that you tend to notice about everything, that is one thing. But if you're singling out a particular group for a particular attribute, that's probably something you need to be mindful of and check and make sure that you're not inadvertently engaging in these microaggressions. So there are several other themes of microaggressions. We're by no means going to go through all, but there are a few others that I think are highly important, not just because they're very common, but I actually think that there has been kind of a transformation generationally as to what is and what is not expected. And that's, again, while these microaggressions live on a spectrum, you also have to understand that our behavior in our society, our behavior in our communities, it modifies and changes over time, just given the changes in our communities. So a really big one is this issue of color blindness. And what do I mean by that? It's statements made by individuals that indicate that usually a member of the dominant culture, so usually someone who is white, does not want or need to acknowledge race. So common examples of when I look at you and they're looking at a Latino man, I don't see color, or there's only one race, the human race. Or I don't believe in race. I only believe in humanity. I'm sure many of you have heard this a lot. And last year, I'm sure many of you, with the kind of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, probably also heard the All Lives Matter movement. Well, the All Lives Matter movement fits squarely into this color blindness type of a microaggression. Because again, we're not going to focus on the intent. Potentially the intent of someone looking at a Latino colleague saying, I don't see color, I see race, is to say, I don't think you're other. I think we're similar, right? That might be the message they're intending, but the impact is the following. It's assimilate to the dominant culture, deny the significance of a person of color's existence, their racial ethnic experience in this country, which may or may not have always been positive. And it denies the fact that that individual is a racial cultural being. And I think, Hannah, you had a wonderful way of explaining this that I think would be wonderful to share with the group.
Yeah, I think what was very interesting in doing these types of trainings, and at BD we offer unconscious bias or conscious inclusion is how we phrase it training. And in training a lot of my colleagues and even those in HR, especially those that have been working for a long time, especially those who've been working in HR a long time, have explained there's really been this progression of the way in which that we talk about race and deal with racism, especially in the workplace. And there was a time when, like, for example, color blindness really was the approach. If we don't see color, then there can't be an offense, right? Then we won't be treating people differently based on their color because we don't see it. And so the concept of color blindness really was how, at least as employers, often dealt with racism and training managers, was just don't see color. If you don't see it, then again, you can't treat people differently because of it. But as we've progressed and as our understanding of conscious and unconscious bias and of microaggressions has really further developed, we really understand, no, that's not how our minds really work. You actually can't shut that off. We are looking at people and getting all of this information, and our brain is creating these shortcuts. And to deny that that's happening is really not actually helpful in the battle and fight against discrimination and racism. And so it really has changed in the way that we talk about race, that we talk about discrimination, that we train our HR professionals and our managers. And acknowledging that can be helpful. Again, in the same way that we don't have to say, because you have an unconscious bias, you are a bad person or you are a racist. It really is just recognizing that there's been a progression, there's been a change, and the way in which we look at this now is in large part due to the benefit of all the social science and studies and sort of our evolution over the last few decades.
Absolutely. So some other areas that social scientists do a lot of work in, and that if when you poll employees, that types of microaggressions they may or may not have experienced are the following. And this is criminality, or some assumption of criminal status. And what does this mean? It's a person of color is presumed to be dangerous, criminal, or deviant based on his or her race. Any of you who have done the unconscious bias workshops or taken the IAT test know that this is heavily studied and really has been confirmed over the years to be true. So some common examples are, and we probably have heard a lot about this in the last year and a half, is a white man or woman clutching his or her purse or checking his or her wallet as someone of color approaches him or her, or a store owner following a customer who is of color and not similarly following a customer who is not. Someone crossing to the other side of the street because they see someone of color approaching him or her. What is the message here? Pretty clearly, it's you are a criminal, or you're going to steal, you are poor, you do not belong, you are dangerous. Clearly, the impact of it, regardless of whether or not it was conscious or unconscious, highly, highly damaging to the recipient of this type of behavior. Something that goes hand in hand with color blindness is this notion of denial of individual racism, sexism, heterosexism, which I think really dovetails nicely with what Hannah talked to us about, which I do think that there's been a progression of how we approach issues of otherness with our friends and particularly within the workplace. So denial of this individual racism or sexism is a statement made when you deny your bias, which we have all recognized. We all have bias. So I'm not a racist. My best friend is Black. Or I'm not homophobic. My best friend is gay. What the intent there most likely is not intended to be offensive. The intent is to say, I love you. I include you. I accept you. But the message being heard, the impact of this is, I could never be a racist because I have friends of color, which is just simply untrue. Your racial oppression is no different than oftentimes you'll hear, oh, I understand what you've gone through as a Black man in the United States because I'm female, right? And that's the denial of the racial experience because you believe you connect because of your gender identity. Well, in that circumstance, the message is your racial oppression is no different than my gender oppression. And that's, again, just simply untrue. They're very different experiences. And it really denies the personal experience of those individuals who experience bias. So if you recall at the beginning of the presentation, we talked about those 3 negative traits or the 3 burdens or challenges associated with being a member of a certain group. It's these types of color blindness or denial of things that really can sometimes contribute to and aggrandize those negative traits. Now, last but not least, we could probably do an entire workshop simply on this last one, which is the myth of meritocracy. And to be candid, it's probably the area that I find the most interesting because I think it's probably one of the most challenging to combat. The notion here, it's statements which assert that race or gender do not play a role in life successes. For example, let's take faculty demographics. Comments like, for the following. Of course he'll get tenure even though he hasn't published much. He's Black. Or you're sitting around a group making a decision about who to hire, you're reviewing all the candidates, and the comment is made, I believe the most qualified person should get the job. And lo and behold, that comment only gets stated when there's a relatively diverse candidate pool. Or men and women have equal opportunities for achievement, so no special treatment should be given to one or the other. So the idea behind this is that people of color or women are given extra or unfair benefits because of their race, and that the playing field is even. So women or people of color, if they can't make it, the problem's with them and not with the system. So it really denies this idea of systemic inequalities that has been discussed largely in the last year, but that we all know are very, very true. So myth of meritocracy is another area where, again, the intent behind the comment, who doesn't want the most qualified individual for the job? We all do, but it's being mindful of when are we saying it, and are we only saying it in certain circumstances, or are we saying it in all circumstances so that bias really isn't to blame for the comment? So any questions, again, feel free to type anything in the chat box or if you have any comments, but we'll go ahead and turn to a discussion about the actual harms caused by microaggressions.
So there comes a place when you are either the one experiencing it or hearing it, where there's this internal dilemma about what actually just happened. Did I hear that right? Did I interpret that correctly? What did they mean by that? Am I being oversensitive, or should I say something? Would it make it worse if I do? I might be overreacting, or they'll think I'm overreacting, or speaking up is going to hurt more than it helps. And there's this sort of internal battle or dilemma that someone can be experiencing, whether they're the target of the comment or just an observer. And I'll give an example. I was at my law school reunion 2 years ago, and I was standing in a group of my peers and my colleagues, and there we were discussing litigation in particular and the unique experience of being in the LA courthouse and, just sort of war stories. And one of the attorneys that was there started to tell this story about his experience at the courthouse, and in particular, sort of mentioning it's like kind of a melting pot. You have all different types of people that are there, all different races, all different colors. And he said that he was there once, and the elevator broke down. So he's in a packed elevator with a lot of different people, and the elevator breaks. And he says, it was amazing how quickly everyone reverted to their stereotypes. And immediately I was like, oh, this is probably not going to be very good. But he's a colleague and up here, and I'm in a group of people. So I continue to smile politely and sort of nod as he explains, yes, when the elevator stops, the Asians immediately start looking at the buttons to see if they can solve the problem. And the African Americans got very thuggish, and the Mexican Americans sat down and did nothing. And it was truly horrifying, but I was frozen, and I continued to sort of nervously smile and laugh. And I looked over at my colleague, someone who had gone to law school with me the entire time, and her face is not amused. She is not smiling. She is not nodding. She is listening, but staring. And seeing the way that she was reacting in some ways gave me a group to belong to that wasn't this other group. It gave me an opportunity to recognize that what was happening was wildly inappropriate and offensive, and it wouldn't be offensive of me to respond to it. I wasn't the one that was saying the things that were inappropriate. And so I looked at her and I stopped smiling and I stopped nodding. And as he wrapped up the story, he sort of looked at us and says, well, that didn't go as I expected. And my friend said, yeah, I wouldn't take that one on the road. So she didn't say anything aggressive. She didn't say that it was inappropriate. She didn't call him out, but she had a very clear message in the way that she responded. And it allowed me to have a reaction as well. But this whole dialogue, this whole experience, I wasn't even a target of what he was saying. He wasn't saying anything about white women at all, but it was so uncomfortable. And these microaggressions, whether we're the target or the bystander or involved, can create this internal dilemma, this dialogue that can be very damaging and create real stressors and harms.
And for any of you that have experienced this, similar to Hannah, it feels paralyzing. You genuinely feel paralyzed in the moment. I'm always shocked that even though I do this work for a living, I'm very passionate about it, and I still find myself paralyzed in certain moments because context does matter. And we'll get to that in a moment. But so I felt really relieved when I heard other people say that they too felt paralyzed, right? That was like, okay, it's not just me. It's a very true reaction to that. And by no means are we, psychologists or experts in psychology, but definitely have read several articles about the actual tangible physical and psychological impacts of microaggressions over time. I'm sure many of you have heard about the notion of it's kind of these paper cuts over time. Sometimes they're actually big gashes. I actually like the idea of a bruise. It's the idea that, it might start off like a little bruise, but if you're hearing that, if it gets poked and hit and even just touched every day, before you know it, that bruise is going to take over your arm, and every interaction that you have might be impacted. Every time you move is impacted by that bruise on your arm. So it can cause all of the things that you see here on the screen. But I think at least within the work context, what I have noticed both from personal experience as well as anecdotal evidence is that it is so distracting and interferes with productivity. When someone engages in this, you stop, you start thinking, gosh, did I just interpret that correctly? Am I thinking of this correctly? You stop doing your work, you get annoyed, you get frustrated, you can't focus. It might interfere with your ability to work with the coworker that engaged in it. And if it's allowed to fester and kind of, not go addressed, it can be very detrimental in the workplace. So how do we interrupt them? And the word interruption it's very intentional. Similar to unconscious bias, you cannot eliminate unconscious bias. I also am reasonable enough to know that given that unconscious bias is the foundation of microaggression, we're likely not going to be able to completely eliminate microaggression. With that said, though, we do have an obligation to, once we recognize it, to figure out ways to interrupt them. So there are several ways that we can do so.
And I think the example of, and I will name her Sandra Pena, for those of you who may have heard of her. She is my hero in that story, my strong supporter who gave me a group to belong to. That's one way of responding. She sort of used humor and confronted at the same time. She didn't ignore it, she addressed it, but more with a humorous tone, like, I wouldn't take that on the road, which is definitely sending a message. It allows everyone to sort of gracefully exit the conversation, but it did also acknowledge sort of what was occurring in that moment. Ignoring it is another opportunity. It does save time, save energy. It may be a way to avoid showing vulnerability or avoid feeling like you're overreacting or may be perceived that way. Now, of course, the risk is that it could allow yourself or others to be harmed by the microaggression, and it doesn't necessarily result in any sort of change. Humor, again, it provides a warning shot. It can allow others to save face, but depending on how direct it is, it might be too subtle. And again, it might not result in any sort of changed behavior or recognition by the aggressor or by the speaker. And then confrontation, of course, there may be times when that can really increase self-esteem. It can deter future behavior. It can inspire change. But depending on the person and the context, will it actually result in change or address the behavior? Will it make it worse? Are you picking the wrong battle potentially?
So what we thought we would do now is really just have a brief discussion of potential reactions, the risks and the benefits from the standpoint of the target of the microaggressor, of the microaggression, from the context of the bystander/upstander, and then from the context of the microaggressor. So starting when you're the target, I think first and foremost, it's to give yourselves license to react in the way that makes sense to you personally and in the context in which you find yourself. So often when I'm doing these trainings, we talk a lot about, is this a relationship? The person with which, the person who engaged in the microaggression, is that someone with whom you want to keep a relationship? Because if so, that might impact the way you speak to him or her. It might be different how you react on the street. If someone walking by engages in a microaggression, you think you're never going to see them again, you might react one way. But if it's a coworker, or if it's your boss, or if it's your subordinate, right? It's really the context is going to matter. At the end of the day, what is universal, regardless when we're talking specifically about the micro-invalidation type of microaggressions, so usually unintentional, is we criticize or we confront the microaggression and not the microaggressor. We really, even though it may be very challenging when you are the target of this, we do need to recognize that the intent was unlikely terrible. Not always, but unlikely terrible. And so if we accuse or demean ourselves, the microaggressor, are we really pushing the needle forward or not? And then number two, when you're the target, at the end of the day, you got to take care of yourself. What does that mean? In a certain situation, speaking up is going to be taking care of yourself. In another situation, remaining silent is going to take care of yourself. And there's no shame associated, there's no judgment associated with how you react in any particular moment. And it may vary from situation to day to mood to whatever it is. I know personally, when I heard somebody talk about this kind of giving yourself license to not say anything was actually quite empowering, because what I would do is be paralyzed in the moment, not say anything, and then beat myself up for 48 hours of, I can't believe I didn't say anything. I should have said this. I should have said that. And sometimes that's true. I should, right? But sometimes it's really difficult. So giving yourself that license is really important.
Sometimes when you're not the target, when you're the bystander, or as Carolina updated, I love this, upstander. If you are going to be someone that is going to stand up, that is going to say something, things to keep in mind. One, be an ally. It's important to have other voices be heard. When the targets of microaggressions complain or respond, sometimes the microaggressor may dismiss them as biased or oversensitive. So having an ally there to also acknowledge, respond, comment can be very helpful. At the same time, however, make sure you're speaking for yourself. Don't try to speak on behalf of the person who's been targeted, since that in and of itself could be its own form of microaggression. Standing up and sort of inserting yourself into the situation and taking control while you feel like you're trying to be an ally, it may also be a way of telling the other person, you're not capable of handling this, I'll handle it for you. And that can in and of itself be damaging. So having someone speak in your favor and be a supporter or an ally is one thing, but taking over or speaking on someone else's behalf and saying, you know, as they must feel this certain way can itself be its own microaggression.
Hannah, I don't know if this has happened to you, but something that I think was an unexpected byproduct of being an upstander is, for many, I'm sure, it's easier to speak up on behalf of someone else usually than it is to speak up on your own behalf. At least that's true for me. And I've noticed that as I get more comfortable being that upstander, it is translated into being more comfortable speaking up on my own behalf. And I hadn't anticipated that. So that might be just a wonderful byproduct of really owning that upstander behavior.
Great point.
And now we can't forget if you've been the microaggressor. I have certainly been a microaggressor. I have some egregious examples that I'm mortified to discuss. But guess what? I am so grateful that I had people around me that were willing to talk to me about it, call me out on it, explain to me why it was harmful, like why what I said was harmful. And I listened. I tried not to be defensive, thankfully, because I already knew that it's not about intent. It is about that impact that really matters. And I knew they knew I didn't intend, right? We had that relationship, which sometimes matters. So acknowledging it, apologizing, reflecting, obviously really, really key. But I think at the end of the day, hope you're fortunate enough to have somebody who's willing to have the conversation with you, or at least a colleague or a friend that's like, really shouldn't say that, or we don't say things like that anymore. But really internalizing and thinking about, okay, I might not personally understand why that comment is harmful because I don't belong to the identity group and I just don't understand. But guess what? I'm going to give that person the benefit of the doubt that they do feel that way. And I don't want them to feel offended. I don't want them to feel excluded. And really approaching it kind of from that humanistic standpoint, I think is really helpful. So here's where I like to call kind of our tool belt of potential. So picture yourself, someone's just said this terrible story, right, about the elevator. You're paralyzed, you're nodding and you're smiling, even though you're just horrified, your insides are turning over. So what to say in the moment? And this actually comes from personal experience or investigations I've conducted. You could actually just even say, ouch, like, kind of humorly, but like, oh, ouch. We don't say that anymore a lot. I have seen that a lot with kind of color blindness. Sometimes, given that things have changed over time, it can be generational. Giving someone a quizzical look, which it sounds like your friend Hannah was doing, or a stern look as opposed to smiling or laughing, because that is a visual cue to the person communicating that, okay, that didn't go well, which clearly the microaggressor in your example, Hannah, got, because he probably got those verbal or nonverbal cues from the group. I think my personal favorite is actually asking someone what they mean by that. So for example, I get told a lot, I got told a lot kind of growing up, wow, I didn't realize you were such a good writer. The assumption, with my name, immigrant parents, even though I'd gone to high school, college, JD, all the above, that shock. And so paralyzed. I really wish that I could go back to the 24-year-old me and just ask them, like, why are you surprised by that? Or what do you mean by that? And just really openly, non-confrontationally, because I think it's those questions in the moment that make someone understand why maybe they had inadvertently said something that is potentially harmful. Or the award-winning actress, you pretend you didn't hear the comment and you actually say, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you say that again? I've done it once and I got the person immediately realized that they shouldn't say, they laugh and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to repeat what I just said. We'll move on. If the person repeats, it's a different story. You have to have a different conversation with them. But at the end of the day, so those are some things that if you're feeling paralyzed, a go-to of asking what they mean can be really great. As an upstander, something that I have found very effective, and I saw somebody do it a few months ago, was somebody was making a generalization about a group of people based on experiences, but definitely a problematic generalization. And someone who wasn't a member of that identity group, an upstander, said, oh, that hasn't been my experience at all, and then gave an example. of, oh, and you know, this at this particular time in my life, they did X, Y, and Z. Just having a conversation where you're interrupting that generalization or that stereotype. And at the end of the day, always focus on the event, focus on the comment, and not on the person. But Hannah, I don't know if you have any other go-tos that you've either done yourself or overheard that have been good interrupters.
You know, I don't know that it would be a go-to phrase, which I like, because I think that can be really helpful when you're paralyzed. But a moment where I actually was able to respond in the moment was I was an attorney at a law firm and was getting ready on some case. And the partner I was working for said, "You'd make a really good secretary." And I immediately responded, "Yeah, I would. I'm very organized. Not a bad lawyer either." And just kind of moved on. And I was lucky that we had a kind of bantering relationship, but I was able to immediately respond to it. So in those circumstances where it is intended as a compliment in some way, you can acknowledge it, but then redirect. So being able to sort of say, but that's actually not my job, is a way to sort of just politely, gently respond.
And I think what that does is if those types of comments go unchecked, the comment gets repeated. Whereas if the comment gets confronted, that individual might think, okay, well, maybe I'm not gonna say that again. I don't think that had the impact that I thought it would have, right? And so next area is, let's just acknowledge, and Hannah, obviously you can walk this, but let's just acknowledge that this can all be really awkward. It can be really uncomfortable, even though it's really important. So here's some tips.
Yeah, absolutely. Understand why it's important to you. Is it important to you to have the conversation? Is it something that's worth it to you to do? Be prepared. You know, as Caroline has mentioned, a lot of times you're frozen in the moment. So is it something that you want to go back to and actually address? Be objective and compassionate. Use I statements. Don't take it personally. Approach the conversation with curiosity. I always say avoid labels and just focus on, as it says, be objective. Focus on the facts. This was said, or this is what happened. This is what happened, and this is how I felt as a result, rather than you made me feel blank because you were being aggressive or you were being insert label there. So focusing on the objective nature of what occurred can be helpful to ease through that conversation.
So we got a question in the chat that's actually wonderful. And it says, what about a situation where you don't realize at the time that the comment was offensive? It caught you off guard, or that you were confused in the moment. But then when you think about it later, you're like, gosh, that was pretty terrible. That was pretty offensive. Any suggestions for going back later to address the issue? And so absolutely. I think for years, I couldn't identify why things bothered me. And it wasn't until I started reading and attending workshops like this that I was like, oh, that's a thing. Like this thing about telling Latinas that they're good writers is a thing. It's not just me. And so one way that you can do it, and it depends on context, is to go and talk to the person that did it and recognize, hey, listen, this happened a long time ago. I completely understand that, but it's something that's kind of stuck with me. And so I just wanted to ask you, kind of like, why did you make that comment? Just want to let you know this is how it made me feel. I think recognizing that it's something that happened a long time ago is important. But another way that I've done it, so I've never gone back to confront the supervisors when I was 24 about the writing comment, but I share these stories when I'm talking to my mentees. I share these stories when I'm talking to my partners as reminders of, hey, listen, this actually happened to me a long time ago and it really bothered me. So maybe you're not addressing the microaggressor, but I think what you're doing is expanding the ability for people to be bystanders or upstanders within your organization.
Completely
so
agree.
Now, in our last few minutes, in a post-COVID world, I look forward to being able to do these workshops in person where we would all split up into little groups and have these discussions. We're only going to go through the first one, and then the second one we'll leave as homework for you all to hopefully, maybe with a group of friends or with people within your organization, practice it. So the first hypo goes as follows. So you are an attorney of Caucasian descent, and you and your colleague of African African-American descent have been preparing for a criminal trial for weeks. On the first day of the trial, you and your colleague enter the courtroom, both dressed in your best suits, and the judge assumes your colleague is the defendant and directs him to sit at the defendant's seat at the table. So what this is meant to do, and Hannah and I are gonna have a dialogue now, is let's think about it from the perspective of the Caucasian attorney. Let's think of it from the perspective of the African-American attorney. And let's think about that spectrum of potential responses, right? Humor, confront, ignore. So Hannah, as the attorney of Caucasian descent, would you say anything in the moment?
I would like to think that I would. I do worry that I would be frozen, but I think for me and my personality, I'm more comfortable with humor. And so I would, if I was able and had the wherewithal to comment, which is obviously a very challenging situation because it wasn't even the bailiff that made that situation, it was the judge. It is the premier power authority in the courtroom. Would potentially be to laugh and say, oh, Your Honor, don't be silly. This is my colleague, etc. And that would probably be the way that I would feel most comfortable doing something if I were not completely paralyzed or frozen in the moment, which I do worry based on my own past experiences is something I need to work on, to practice.
Of course, and I think what you identified so often happens when there is a power dynamic, that paralysis that we feel is magnified, right? But I think things to consider here and things to consider in general is if we're not an upstander in this situation and we're in front of a jury, what credibility will our African-American, colleague have? And our African-American colleague who has been preparing, nights on end with you, and what kind of impact will it have on your relationship with your colleague if you don't say anything? And then sometimes I think of it this way is, who is it easier to speak up? Is it easier for the Caucasian attorney to speak up or for the African-American attorney to speak up in that situation? I think it depends. But I think a lot of people would say, it's probably easier to be the upstander than the target who's saying, because of everything that we have been discussing. But this is, I think, a prime example that shows that in a situation where there are real life impacts about these microaggressions, right? The credibility with the judge, credibility with the jury, the relationship between these two colleagues, if something doesn't get said. So something to think about is often we think we have to say something in the moment. And sometimes that's the most appropriate response. But maybe it's at sidebar and maybe it's outside the presence of your colleague. And you say, listen, Your Honor, this is my colleague. We've been working together, to really remind the judge or the person about what's going on. So I did want to go to unless you had anything else, Hannah, that you wanted to say.
No.
And so if everybody, if you want to just take a quick picture of your screen, also we'll probably be circulating these slides anyhow. But here's a second one. This is actually a personal one. This happened to me. And so I hope that I get to see some of you at an event in person, and we can talk about what I should have done, because what I did was nothing. And this is me now, years later, kicking myself for not having done anything. So this is, you join your supervisor in an interview of a candidate for a job. Despite the student who is Latina having been born in the United States, your supervisor expresses admiration for command of the English language, complimenting her for being so articulate and well-spoken. And the reason that they would have known that I was a US citizen, the job I was applying for required US citizenship. And so kind of to make it, so think about again from the target, the upstander, the power dynamics, and that. And let me just say, I think we've had one more comment. Let me just quickly read it. And so the example that's being given in the chat is when there are generalizations made about people of certain cultural backgrounds tending to be more violent or less violent. For example, Mexico, that family, that there's increased crime, and kind of what to do in that time. And so this person can think of at least 4 times the group saying what. And so I'm so sorry if I'm not doing a good job of retelling this one. Hold on. Okay, so this is kind of in the reverse. I apologize. I think I did it the other way. And so this is maybe somebody who, in trying to interrupt a microaggression, is being defensive, I think is what it is. So at times when generalizations are made, or you want to, excuse or defend things that happen that are within your identity group, that sometimes it can be that we can become a little bit defensive. And we have to think about what the impact of that is as well. As much as we shouldn't be defensive as the microaggressor when confronted, we also need to be careful about being overly defensive when we are confronting individuals about those microaggressions, because our message may get lost in translation. So to conclude really quickly, really quick takeaways. So what do? Let's just slow down. Let's think about what we say, come at it from a humanistic standpoint, and really listen to our colleagues when they're brave enough and courageous enough to tell us that maybe something we've done has inadvertently caused them some pain. Educate yourself like you're doing here today, and apologize when necessary. Hannah, any other takeaways?
Yeah, just a note for everybody. We will be sending out a handout that really has some more employment-specific examples of how to interrupt this unconscious bias, these microaggressions, what to do in an employment setting when it comes to interviewing candidates and performance evaluations. So some real-life examples on how to address those in the workplace. So I hope you find that useful. I hope you found this useful. And I'm sure Carolina and I would both be absolutely willing to talk to anybody who has questions or wanted to continue the dialogue.
Thank you so much, everybody, for attending.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, everyone.